Now I want to move on to looking at jQuery. So I'll jump on over to week 6. Okay, so the jQuery notes I've got here aren't nearly as long and involved as the JavaScript stuff, which is good. And the good thing about jQuery is that there's nothing magical about jQuery. jQuery is simply JavaScript. Okay, it's a bunch of predefined functions in JavaScript that are available to you that do a bunch of stuff. So most of the stuff you need to know about jQuery is already the stuff that we've talked about with JavaScript. So what jQuery is jQuery is what we call a JavaScript framework or JavaScript library. And as I said, it's just a bunch of JavaScript that allows us to do certain things. And in terms of jQuery, the things that it deals with, you can generally break them down into one or two areas. The first one is it deals with cross-browser inconsistencies in how the DOM, the document object model, is implemented across different browsers. Now this is something that's getting better as browsers progress, but especially if you're trying to support older browsers, there are inconsistencies with the JavaScript that you need to write to do the same thing across different browsers. So that's really annoying, having to rewrite the same thing different ways to get the same thing to work across different browsers. So one of the things that jQuery does is provide us new functions that essentially do the same things that JavaScript does, but handles all of the cross-browser inconsistencies for us. And I've got a link here to a talk by the guy who developed jQuery. If you're interested in looking at some of those, the history of the cross-browser compatibility stuff, but that's only if you're interested. It's way more involved than you need to be for this. The second thing that that jQuery does for us is it creates more efficient ways of performing common tasks, and I'll explain what those are as we go through. So jQuery is not the only JavaScript framework. There's many JavaScript frameworks that exist, and I've got a link here to a Wikipedia article that compares a bunch of them and their various features. Okay, so, but jQuery is by far the most popular one, and is used by lots of big companies, lots of people, and so it's a good one to if it's your first introduction to jQuery frameworks, it's a good one to start with. And for a lot of people, it's the only one they ever use. But just know that there are other ones out there that have their benefits and drawbacks. So what is jQuery? Well, taken directly from the jQuery website, their description is jQuery is a fast, small, and feature-rich JavaScript library. It makes things like HTML document traversal and manipulation, event handling, animation, and AJAX much simpler with an easy-to-use API that works across a multitude of browsers. Okay, so essentially that's a concise way of saying it does these two things and makes these things easier to do. Okay, first things first, how do we include jQuery in a web page? Again, because jQuery is just JavaScript, essentially all you do is you download the jQuery JavaScript file and you include it in your web page like you'd include any other JavaScript file. So there's a link here to the download page on jQuery.com. Okay, and you'll notice that there's a bunch of stuff and a bunch of potential downloads. All you really need to know is, well, first of all, there's a 1.x version and a 2.x version of jQuery. Which one you use doesn't really matter that much for this unit. The reason that they have two different versions is kind of explained here. The version 2 of jQuery is basically dropping support for Internet Explorer 8 and below. And the reason that they do that is because if you stop having to support them, then you can take out a bunch of legacy code and make the file smaller. So other than that, using them is pretty much the same. So you'll probably still find most examples use jQuery 1, and I've used jQuery 1 in these examples, but it really doesn't matter. The only thing that really matters for your decision here is whether or not you want to support older versions of Internet Explorer, which for this unit you don't have to worry about. But otherwise, the example should be the same. Not much is really going to change between the two. So now within a given version number, though, there's a few different things you can download. Essentially, the only two that you're really interested in are either of these, the compressed production jQuery or the uncompressed development jQuery. Now I generally don't bother with this one. I just use the compressed one straight away because you don't really ever have any need to look through the jQuery code. But if you do want to look through the jQuery code, then the uncompressed development version is the one you want to read. If I download that and I open it up, okay, you can see it's nothing magical, it's just JavaScript, a bunch of variables and functions that do stuff. Okay, but the compressed production jQuery is the exact same thing, but they've just taken out all of the spaces and comments and stuff, so the file's smaller, but obviously more difficult to read. Okay, but if you just want the simple answer, just go for this one, the compressed production jQuery. There's also the option, if you want, of including jQuery from a external CDN or content developer network. This is essentially just rather than downloading the file yourself and putting it on your own server, you can download it directly off jQuery servers or off the Google's hosted server and stuff like that. There's certain advantages to that that you can look into if you want, but otherwise it's no different. You're still including it as a script tag. The source just points to a remote server rather than a local file. Okay, so this is, once you've got the jQuery file, you include it in your web page just like any other JavaScript file. But again, the important thing is that the order of inclusion of your scripts matters. So if I've got my own custom JavaScript here, which I've put in a file called main.js, and it uses jQuery functions, then I need to make sure that jQuery is being included before that. Okay, otherwise this one will throw an error anytime I try and reference jQuery from it. So jQuery first, and then your scripts. Now, I want to mention quickly the document ready function. So I did mention when we were talking about vanilla JavaScript, when I say vanilla JavaScript, I just mean JavaScript by itself without any other framework. We talked about the window.onload event, where you can define a function so that your code doesn't run until the content has all loaded. Now, the only drawback to this is that the window.onload event waits until both the HTML and the images have all been downloaded. And especially if you've got lots of images or big images, this can create a noticeable delay in delaying the user before they can interact with the page. So generally what you want to do is you want JavaScript to wait until the HTML is all downloaded and the DOM's been created, but not wait until the images have been downloaded before it starts executing. So that's what jQuery offers us with this document.ready function. It's essentially the same deal as the window.onload function. You put your code inside the function handler, and it will execute once the HTML is downloaded, but it doesn't bother to wait for the images to download. So again, generally it's a good practice to keep all of your jQuery code inside of this document.ready event handler. You can use jQuery and jsfiddle, which again I have for some examples here. You'll notice on jsfiddle there's a section on the side which allows you to include not just jQuery but a whole bunch of, optionally, a whole bunch of different frameworks as well. Okay, so but there's jQuery there. You can include it like that, and you'll also notice that there's also, you can use the on DOM ready option here so that any code that you write down here will effectively be written in a document.ready function event handler. Okay, how do we find out what jQuery does and how it does it? Well, the main place you want to look is the official jQuery website's documentation. So I've got a link to that here. But you can also find it under their menu link to API documentation. So this basically explains all of the functionality of jQuery, and it's got it organized on the left here by sort of different categories. Okay, and I'll go through some of the more relevant ones. But this documentation is generally really good. If you go into any particular section, they'll generally have code examples and even interactive examples of a whole bunch of stuff, and show you what the outcome looks like. Okay, so that's the first place that I'd suggest looking. Now, before I get into those, get into any more of this, I need to address what this $sign is that you keep seeing in jQuery code. Okay, so it's even in this first example here with the document.ready function. So this confuses a lot of people when they first start to look at jQuery, but actually there's nothing special about it. All this $sign is a function. Okay, so if you remember back to when we were talking about naming variable names and function names in JavaScript, okay, the $sign was along with the underscore sign the only non-alphanumeric characters that you could use to name a variable or a function. So actually the $sign just by itself is a perfectly valid name for a variable or a function. And the reason that jQuery and many other JavaScript frameworks use it is because it's actually an alias or a synonym for the core jQuery function, which you can see here. And the reason that they provide a different way of writing it, and you can see it's written down here, the jQuery function call can also be written as $sign. The reason they do it is because pretty much everything you do with jQuery involves first calling this jQuery function, and because you're going to do it over and over again, one character is faster to type than a bunch, and that's the only reason. So anywhere where you see code that has this $sign function, you can substitute it with this jQuery, okay, and it will be functionally identical. So don't let it confuse you just because it's a weird character. So what we use the $sign or the jQuery function for is firstly for selecting elements. So whereas with vanilla JavaScript we had a bunch of different methods for selecting elements, like get element by ID, get elements by tag name, and get elements by class name, jQuery simplifies this down and uses a single function, this $function or the jQuery function, to select a set of elements. And the way that it does it is quite clever. What you pass it is a CSS selector, and what it will do is return you a set of elements that match that CSS selector. So that's really useful because most people who are learning jQuery have already done HTML and CSS. They understand how CSS selectors work to some extent. So it gives you a much more powerful way of selecting elements than having to only select by ID, tag name, or class name. You can combine all sorts of selectors. So for example, in this example here, I can select any paragraph with an ID of output by passing the $sign function, this CSS selector there. Or as a slightly more complex one, I could select any direct descendant of the body element with a class of section by passing the jQuery function that CSS selector there. So any valid CSS selector is a valid jQuery selector. Okay, jQuery event handling. This is not that much different than how vanilla JavaScript does it. The main things that jQuery takes care of to do with events is to do with cross-browser inconsistency and how they're implemented. So if you write your events like this, you can be sure that they're going to work across all different browsers the same way. So the most flexible way of handling events with jQuery is to use its on method. I guess it's similar to the add event listener method in vanilla JavaScript. And the process is quite similar. We select some elements, one or more elements, and then on those elements we call the on function, and then the on function takes two parameters. The first one is again the name of an event, like click or double click or whatever you want, and those event names are exactly the same as the event names that you would use for plain vanilla JavaScript. And then the second parameter is the event handler function, where we write our code that we want to execute in response to that event being triggered. Okay, so in this example here, and I need to open up the console for this one. Okay, I've got a button with the ID of go that says click me, and when I click it, it's outputting this E variable to the console log, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. But in order to attach this event, first I select the button with the ID of go, and then I call the jQuery on method on top of that. I pass it click as the first parameter, as the event type I want to listen for, and then I define my event handler function here. The only difference between this part and when I did it in vanilla JavaScript is that it's got this extra parameter that's being passed here. So this parameter that's being passed is any time in jQuery you define an event handler function, it will always be passed, or you always have access to an object that will be passed which contains information about the event that just occurred. Okay, and you can call this whatever you want. I've called it E for shorthand for event, but you sometimes see it written as EVT or event. Okay, you can call it whatever you want as long as you refer to it by the same name within the function. But all it is, and you can see this when I click the button and it outputs that object to the console, it's a object that contains a bunch of useful information about the event. Now, a lot of the time you won't need to use any of this information, so you don't have to pass it. But it's there and it contains information that's potentially useful for the event. Okay, so things like this current target property of the event object will show you what element actually triggered the event. You can get things like the height and the width and the X and Y position of a bunch of stuff. It will record the timestamp at which the event occurred. So if that information is relevant to you, you can access that, and a whole bunch of other stuff which is documented in the jQuery documentation. A lot of the time you won't use it, but it's there if you need it. So essentially this is the equivalent of, if I had have written this in vanilla JavaScript, saying document.get element by ID go dot add event listener click function. And then the same stuff inside. Okay, so those things are essentially the same. And another common misconception is that you have to choose to write either JavaScript or jQuery. It's not true. You can mix them up as much as you want, because again, jQuery is simply just JavaScript. It's just, all jQuery is a bunch of functions that you're calling that have been defined in a different JavaScript file. So if there's something that you would rather, if there's some things you'd rather do with jQuery and other things that you'd rather do with vanilla JavaScript, then there's nothing wrong with mixing them up. They'll work perfectly fine together. Okay, so there's just a screenshot of the event object in the console. Okay, and again, I haven't gone through a whole bunch of different events, but jQuery should be able to handle any of the standard HTML DOM events, okay, that we've looked at already here. Now, some of these events will have shorthand methods, so we can write the previous example something like this. Instead of selecting the Go button and using the on method, we can apply a click event handler by just calling this click method here. So I guess that's similar to using in plain JavaScript the onClick attribute. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's a bunch of those shorthand methods that exist that you can find in the jQuery documentation. And if you want to use that, that's fine. Although I generally always write my jQuery events using this on method, because the one thing that it allows us to do that the shorthand methods don't is that because you're defining the events as a parameter here, you can actually tell this function to execute in response to a bunch of different events. So I could instead of just writing click here, I could write click, double click, hover, mouse out. I could get it to respond to all of those events just by separating those event strings with a space. So this can be useful for things like, especially when you're dealing with stuff like form validation. So when you're dealing with form validation, let's say you've got a text input, and maybe every time the content of that text input changes, you want to validate it to check that it's that they haven't entered text into a number field or something like that. So when you think about the events that can trigger a change on an input field, typing can change it using the mouse, right click, cut and paste. Moving away from the field or moving back to it, all of these sorts of things can change it. And so you can specify all of those different events and the one function which deals with any of those changes using this on method. Okay, so that's events in jQuery. Now I want to go back for a moment and have another look at this $ function. So a lot of functions in jQuery actually have dual roles. They perform different tasks depending on what it is that you send to them as a parameter. So we've already looked at the jQuery, the $ function operating as a selector. If you pass that function a CSS selector, it will return you a set of elements that match that selector. But you can also pass it a HTML string, and it's clever enough to know the difference. And if you pass it an HTML string, it will actually create for you an HTML element in memory, or a DOM element in memory that you can then use. And a lot of people sort of go, well, why would you ever want to do that? If it's just in memory, it's not on the page, then what use is it? But there are actually scenarios where you would want to have elements in memory but not let them appear all the time on the page. So you might have some interactive thing where you're let's say you've got something where you're showing a bunch of layers and you're hiding and showing layers in various different combinations. So when you hide a layer, if you were to delete all of the visual elements in that layer and then they want to show it again, you'd have to recreate those and apply all the same styles and stuff again, especially if you add in if they've customized any of those from user input, that can get really complicated. But if rather than deleting the elements, you simply just keep them in memory but take them out of the DOM tree, then you can keep them there with all of their functionality and all of their properties. And then when you want them back on the page again, you just insert them back into the DOM. So actually having DOM elements as memory can be actually very useful. Now manipulating the DOM with jQuery is more flexible than with vanilla JavaScript as well. So most of the DOM manipulation we did with JavaScript was to select an element and then modify that element's inner HTML property and assign it a value. Now, jQuery has essentially the equivalent of this, but rather than a property, it's a method. So jQuery has this .html method. Okay, and there's a link to the documentation here which describes it, but it's pretty simple. I detail it in this example here. So in this example, my HTML, I've just got an empty div with an ID of circle container. My CSS, I've defined a class called circle, which makes whatever it's applied to appear like this, like a circle. And in this case, what I'm doing here is I'm inserting some HTML content into this div using the jQuery's HTML method here. So first of all, I need to select the div that I want to insert the content into. So I'm using the CSS selector hash circle container, so it finds me the element with the ID of circle container. Then I'm calling the HTML method and I'm passing it this HTML string here, so span with the class of circle, and then that will get injected into the div element here. Now after that, I'm using the console.log to output the result of calling the HTML function on that circle container again, but this time I'm not passing it any parameters. And what the HTML function does when you don't pass it anything is, rather than inserting something, it returns what the current value of the HTML is there. So I can see here, this is where it's output. After I've injected the content in there, calling circle container.html with no parameters, now putting it to the console, okay, shows me the HTML content of that div as it now exists, which should have exactly what I put in there, the span with a class of circle, and that's what you can see there. So essentially this acts as what we call both a getter and a setter. Depending on if you send it something, it acts as a setter, it sets some value, and if you call the function without any parameters, it acts as a getter. It gets the value of whatever the HTML is of that element. Okay, but by far the more useful jQuery methods for modifying the DOM are things like the append, prepend, and remove functions. So the biggest problem with the plain JavaScript in our HTML property is, in the examples that we used it in, we were pretty much just putting content into empty containers. And so what happens is that if you set the inner HTML property of something where there's already content in there, it blasts that content away and replaces it with whatever you tell it to here. Now the problem with that is we don't always want to get rid of some content and replace it. Sometimes we want to add to content or remove a bit of content away from it rather than replacing everything. And so that's quite difficult to do with vanilla JavaScript, because what you would have to do in that case is store the current value of the inner HTML to a variable and then sort of do some string concatenation to add the thing on that you want to add in there and then put it back into the inner HTML property. Okay, so that's sort of a roundabout way of multiple steps of having to do that. With jQuery, it's a lot simpler because it provides you these append, prepend, and remove functions which sort of take care of all that string manipulation behind the scenes for you. So this is an example of that uses some of those methods. Okay, so in this case here, what I've got is a button, add circle button, and when I click it, what it's going to do is add some of these span elements to this circle container div here. Now down in my JavaScript code, you can see that as well as the span by itself, inside of that span, I'm also outputting a number, which is this circle ID variable that I'm keeping a track of and then adding 1 to every time a circle is clicked. Okay, because they all look kind of the same, that lets me know exactly which circle is which. Now, if I had have done this modifying the inner HTML, it would, every time I added a circle, it would just get rid of whatever circles were already there, and I just keep seeing one circle being added over and over again. In this case, what I'm doing, so this is inside my add circle buttons click event handler. Down here is actually where I'm adding the circle, and I'm using this append function here, which means that if I look at the source code, okay, there's my circle container there. Let me just rerun this from the beginning. Okay, there's my circle container there. The div is empty. When I add a circle, okay, I can see that it's added, there's one span in there. When I click it again, because I'm using the append method, append adds something to the end of the content. Okay, so I should be able to see that the circle with the number 2 in it will add after the number 1. Okay, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and then that's why it's appearing in this order here. If I change this to prepend, okay, then what will happen, okay, there's my empty circle container again. Now what will happen is each time I add one, it will actually add it at the beginning of the element that it's adding it to. So notice it adds it in the reverse order. Okay, so that's what the append and prepend functions do, but I need to kind of explain what I'm doing in between there. So I'll set that back to append. Okay, so now the process of actually adding the circle, what I'm doing is I'm actually creating this circle in memory first. And the reason that I'm doing this rather than inserting it straight into the DOM is so that down here I can add a click event handler on each circle that I've created before I add it to the page itself. So when I create the circle in memory, I'm using the jQuery, the $ function, and using not its selector function. I'm not sending it a CSS selector, I'm sending it an HTML string, so what it's going to return to me there is one of these circles, but just store it in a variable in memory without adding it to the page. Then with that circle I've created, I'm adding a click event handler with a function, and all this does is it's designed to, when I click on one of these, okay, it will remove that circle. So you can see inside of the function handler, it says this.remove. So remove is the jQuery function that will remove something from the DOM. And inside of any event handler function in jQuery, if you want to refer to the thing that triggered the event, you can use this $this. Okay, so that's how it's working. And again, because I've output sort of an ID with each one of these, I can tell that it's actually removing the one that I'm clicking, not just the last one or the first one. So if I click on the 6th one, I can see that 6 has been removed, 3, 5, and then I can keep adding circles and it keeps going up with the ID counter. Okay, but the main thing to take away from this is the append and prepend and remove methods and how they allow us to either add things to the beginning or end of a container, and also to remove something selectively from a container. So if you're going to try and write the equivalent of this remove function in plain JavaScript, you'd have to select the inner HTML, that whole string of all of those, and then figure out which part of that string was actually the thing you wanted to remove, cut that out, and then join the bits back together. So this makes it way easier to do it this way with jQuery. Okay, CSS manipulation with jQuery is another thing that's makes something that's quite painful in vanilla JavaScript a lot less painful in jQuery. Okay, so again, as with vanilla JavaScript, there's a couple of ways you can do it. I've got a link here to the CSS section of jQuery documentation. You can do sort of the equivalent of modifying the element style object properties directly by using the jQuery CSS function. which simply takes a couple of parameters: the name of the CSS style that you want to modify, and then the value that you want to change it to. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, and there's good examples of that in the documentation here. But again, it's probably better to keep your style information separate in the CSS. So the way that I'd suggest you handle modifying your styles is to predefine your CSS classes, and then use jQuery's add class or toggle class methods in order to change what classes are being applied to certain elements. So this example here, again, this is the example that allows me to add a bunch of circles. Now the only things I've changed here is on each circle's click handler function, rather than removing itself, what I'm doing here now is saying this circle add class green. So when I click these now, again, if I look at the elements in my inspection window, okay, there I can see all of those circles that I've added. When I click on one of these now, it should add a class of green to the span here. And you can see, as opposed to plain jQuery's class name, where it would, if I had to set class name green, it would have blasted away the circle class that's already there. Okay, add class and remove class is smart enough to read the class string here and figure out which parts to take out and which parts to leave. Okay, and so add class will always add, remove class will always remove, but then you've also got toggle class as well. So when I hit this button here, the toggle green, okay, I've got this toggle green button has its own click event handler, which will select all of the circles inside of that circle container and then toggle the class green. So what that will mean is that if the green class is already applied, it will take it away. But if it doesn't have the green class, it will add it. So you should be able to see here, okay, I've got 3 of these with green selected. When I hit toggle green, it's going to take green off those ones and add green to the ones that aren't there. So essentially, they're all going to reverse. Okay? Again, something that'd be quite complex to code yourself in plain JavaScript is just a single function call in jQuery. Okay. So that's the add class and the toggle class and remove class functions. And then we've also got, and this is really the last thing I want to cover with jQuery, is jQuery animation effects. So again, while you could do animation in plain JavaScript by setting up some timer function and modifying properties every time it ticks, okay, jQuery makes this stuff a bit more simple to deal with. So jQuery, while you can extend it with other plugins, jQuery has some built-in support for reasonably simple animations. And so again, there's a whole section on the jQuery documentation about animation. They put it under a category called effects. And so you can see there's some built-in effects here like show, slide down, slide toggle, slide up, and fade, okay, stuff like that. So this example here demonstrates some of those. So in this case, I've still got my circle, but I've gotten rid of all of the functionality to add and remove them. I've just got the one circle here. And I just want to demonstrate some of the different animation effects that you can have. So the first one is I've got the toggle button here, and when I click the toggle button, it selects the circle and it calls this function called toggle. And I'll back this up a little bit actually. So your simplest animation functions are hide, okay, which will hide, and also show, which will do the opposite. Now toggle is essentially just a combination of hide and show. Okay, just like we had toggle class, you can have toggle, which toggles the visibility of it. So if I change this to toggle, right, then if it's visible, it will hide it. If it's invisible, it will show it. And generally, that's kind of the thing you want to do. rather than have to keep track of the visible state yourself and have different event listeners to show and hide. Toggle is much more useful. Then we've got, you can have fade in and fade out, and then fade toggle, which is the toggle equivalent of that. Okay, so that fade toggle button, inside of its click event handler, I'm selecting the circle and I'm calling this function called fade toggle. Now, the toggle function takes no parameter here because it happens instantly. Fade toggle happens over a certain duration. So as a parameter, you can adjust how long the animation takes by sending it a number for the duration. And up here, I've saved this number in a variable called fade duration, and the number is always defined in milliseconds. Okay, so that's 400 milliseconds that animation will take. If I change this number, if I want it to take a second, then I can tell it to take 1,000 milliseconds. Okay, and now that animation from start to finish will take 1,000 milliseconds. I can make it take 10 seconds by changing that to 10,000. Okay, and then it will take a really long time. All right. Okay, and while I don't have a button for it here, the only other real built-in animations that you have are also slide. So you got slide in, slide out, and slide toggle. Okay, which looks something like this. Okay, so the built-in animations for jQuery are really only meant to be used for things that are common for sort of UI interfaces. So fading things in, fading things out, and showing things, hiding things, sliding things in, sliding things out. If you want anything more complex than that, you can use jQuery's animate function to define a custom animation. So this third button here, custom animation, inside of its event handler, again I select the circle, but this time I'm calling the jQuery function animate. All right, and this takes some slightly more complex parameters. Even though it's written over a few lines, that there is the first parameter. It's a object literal definition. Okay, so an object, remember, we can define an object contains a bunch of properties. In this case, the animate function, essentially anything you're animating is you're animating CSS. So any of this animation, what it's doing is it's changing the value of the CSS style, and it's changing a little bit over time. So what this first parameter that animate wants you to give it is an object which contains one or more CSS properties and the values that you want to animate them to. And then the second parameter is the duration you want the animation to take again. So in this case, we know that we can adjust where just from our CSS, we know that we can adjust the position of an element relative to where it sits by making sure that we've given the position relative, and then we can use the left and the top or the bottom and the right properties to make it offset it from where it would otherwise be. So the first thing I've done is made sure I've given it position relative. If I leave it as the default position static, these will have no effect. Okay, but once I've done that, I can tell it to animate the left and the top properties. So what this is going to do is it's going to animate the left property to go from whatever it currently is to a new value of 200 pixels, and the top property to go to a value of 200 pixels also. So these will animate at the same rate, so what you should see, it will animate diagonally down. So left across 200 and from the top 200. Okay, and when I click the button, you can see that that's exactly what it does, and it takes 2,000 milliseconds or 2 seconds to perform that animation. Okay, now I can add pretty much whatever CSS styles I want here. Let's say I want to make the width animate to 20%, and let's not do that. I might get confusing. Let's say let's make the width animate to, say the width starts off at 100 pixels. Let's say we want to make it go down to 20 pixels, and we'll make the height go up to 200 pixels. Okay, so it's going to look dumb, but this should change. Okay, so you can animate multiple CSS properties as long as you define them in this object that you send as the first parameter here. Now, you can again do slightly more complex animations than that because the animate function takes an optional third parameter, which itself is a function that will be executed when that first animation finishes. So I could, for example, make this animate down and then back to its original position by providing as a third parameter to this animate function a new function. Okay, which again calls circle.animate. Okay, with new values for left and top. Okay, which I'm just setting to its original values of 0 and 0. And then I'll tell it to take, it can take a different amount of time. I'll tell it to take only 1 second. Yep, you can, and if you want, you can keep chaining them together. So let's just make sure that this works so far. So it does the first one, then calls that second function, which should happen twice as fast as the first one. And yep, you're absolutely right. You can keep chaining these functions together if you want. Only thing with that is your code will pretty quickly get hard to read and keep track of. So if you do want more complicated animations than that, there are jQuery plugins that are designed specifically for animation that have a bit more elegant syntax for defining the animations that you can look into. But yeah, essentially that's how you deal with animations in jQuery. And essentially what you're doing is you're modifying a CSS, you're modifying one or more CSS properties over a given duration. Okay, so that covers pretty much most of the things you need to know about jQuery, particularly for this class. There's other stuff that we didn't cover, mostly Ajax stuff, which is more about loading data dynamically, but it's probably not that relevant to this class. But one thing you should know about jQuery is that another really good thing about it is that it's really extensible. So you can add other things onto jQuery. It's got a plugin framework, so you can add sort of plugins on that allow you to do even more stuff that the core jQuery doesn't have built in. So actually, many existing UI frameworks like Bootstrap that we already looked at uses jQuery for all of its JavaScript stuff. So if you remember back to when we talked about Bootstrap, I said there was this JavaScript section which has a bunch of stuff, okay, like carousels and various different things like this. Okay, all of these interactive components of Bootstrap are actually built on top of jQuery. So if you're using Bootstrap, you don't actually have to include jQuery again. It will already be included. And actually, all of these components, like this carousel, for example, are built as jQuery plugins that Bootstrap has built that work on top of jQuery. So you could actually take any of these plugins and use them even separately from Bootstrap as long as you included jQuery as well. So that's good to know, but probably more importantly is to talk about jQuery plugins themselves. So jQuery plugins are again just extra JavaScript files with more functionality that build on top of what jQuery offers by itself. So you can find lots of jQuery plugins at the official jQuery plugin directory, which is plugins.jquery.com. Okay, you can browse them based on different categories. So here's, as I was just saying, a bunch of ones that do different animation stuff. Okay, and you can see there's pages and pages of them here that you can go through and look at. So it's 273 plugins, just jQuery plugins, just for animation, just on this particular plugin page in jQuery. So this doesn't necessarily contain all of the jQuery plugins exist. Okay, there's others that are hosted on GitHub or other people's web pages. So don't think you're just restricted to what you can find here. If you do a search for a jQuery plugin and then the thing that you're trying to do, you're pretty much guaranteed to find a jQuery plugin or at least some example code of achieving that particular effect. If it's possible to do, then someone's probably already done it. Now, one particular set of plugins that's worth mentioning is jQuery UI. So it again is sort of hosted on an official jQuery page, and it's a curated set of plugins that is designed to sort of extend the UI stuff involved with jQuery. So that involves things like giving you more complex interactions. So things like drag and drop. And again, there's generally all of these plugins generally have good documentation and demo pages. Okay, so you can see a demo here, and you can view the source and see that all you really have to do is include the jQuery UI plugin. And then to make something draggable, it's simply a case of that being a div which contains some content. And then the code that you have to write is simply this line here is simply essentially all you need to do to get that draggable functionality. So it's selecting the element that you want to make draggable and then calling this function draggable. Okay, and just by doing that, it then takes care of all of this functionality like this. Okay, and then you've got various extensions to all that. You've got drag and drop. Okay, so you can do stuff like that. If you want to do drag and drop stuff, takes care of that for you. Resizability stuff. Okay, again, this is all stuff you could code in vanilla JavaScript if you want, but it's already been done. I mean, why type 1,000 lines of code to do it when someone's already done it and you can type one line of code, right? Selectable stuff, sortable stuff. Okay, so all sorts of sort of more advanced interactive UI stuff this offers you. Then it's got a bunch of widgets which are essentially just pre-built user interface components. So like this accordion here, or a menu, progress bar, date picker is a good one. So essentially you just apply this plugin to a date input and it gives you a nice pop-up here. This is something that HTML5 date inputs will do now, but again, not all browsers will support them, so this will make sure it works across multiple browsers. And then you've got extensions to animation, so extra effects. So one thing you can't do with the core jQuery animation is to animate color, but with jQuery UI you can, so you can do something like this where it will animate from one color smoothly to another color, so in this case white to red, and the text going black to white, like so. Okay, you've also got different easing options. So when we talk about easing, we talk about how the animation changes over time. So the most simple version of this is to have linear easing. So these, you'll see easing sort of represented as a graph like this, which it's sort of like you can plot time on one axis and then whatever variable you're animating on the other axis, and then so this sort of indicates how that variable changes over time. The most simple form is linear, which means it just constantly changes. But if you've ever done any sort of simple animation stuff, you know, one of the first things I say is that there's very few things in nature that animate at a constant rate. And so people are used to seeing things animate with like acceleration and deceleration. Okay, so usually we call that in terms of animation and ease in and ease out. So it starts slow and gets faster and then slows down rather than animating constantly. So you can apply any of these easing methods to any of your animations to have them animate in certain ways as well, rather than just linear. Okay, and the other thing with these jQuery UI widgets is that they're themable as well, so you can select, make them different colors. So just for the date picker widget, for example, well, this is all the widgets that it offers, but you can select pre-built themes, which essentially is just providing you with different CSS styles. Okay, and you can create your own as well. Okay, so they're all sort of stored together in the jQuery UI, but when you download it, you can select and pick which parts you want. So if you don't ever want to use the widgets, but you do want the, let's say the drag and drop stuff, and you want also the effect stuff, you can just select those. Okay, so now in terms of including jQuery plugins, again, there's nothing magic about it. A jQuery plugin is just going to be a JavaScript file, maybe a CSS file as well, but you just include those like you would include your own JavaScript and CSS. But again, the important thing is that where you include it, the order of which you include the scripts is important. So all jQuery plugins are going to require that you first have jQuery, and then you include the jQuery plugin, and then you include your code, which uses the jQuery plugin, which will use jQuery itself. Okay, so you can call these things dependencies. Basically, anything that's a dependency of something else has to be included first. Okay, and again, I've just got some more resources to jQuery stuff. Again, the jQuery official documentation is really excellent. It's the place where you'll find most of the stuff. Code Academy has a jQuery course as well for interactive learning with jQuery. And then W3 Schools has a jQuery section, and then there's a link to jQuery tutorials at Lynda as well. Again, don't feel like you have to learn every single aspect of JavaScript or jQuery. Just learn bits and pieces as they become relevant to you. That's the best way of doing it. And really, the best way of learning is to play around with play around with code examples and see what they do. Use your developer tools to see what's going on at different points, and just learn a little bit at a time as it's useful to you, or as it becomes relevant to you.